Good morning and welcome to Global Shift, where we track the global transition away from the neoliberal world disorder to a new emerging planetary order and help to unpack and make sense of the latest news and geopolitical events. Today I want to cover the rising tempo of what is now undoubtedly a Cold War being waged on two fronts, given the signing of a new alliance between the leader of the Liberal Democratic Party and Prime Minister of Japan and the US administration, targeting China on the Pacific front. I also want to cover the European front in Ukraine, where, ironically, we have a hot war with Russia, which the US wants to dial down, albeit trying at the same time to save face with talk of escalation. The Russians themselves, after their initial incursion in Ukraine to neutralize what they saw as a military threat, now turn to a defensive strategy to protect their economic gains and to prioritize engagement with a China gearing up for a new bout of growth. This Chinese prospect is also of vital importance to the East Asian nations that the US is thus problematically trying to recruit into a Pacific NATO. For our full analysis of these issues, please read our latest article on globalshift.com, which you can find a link for in the video description below. I would like to cover this subject matter in 4 points. My first point about the White House signing of an alliance on the 13th of January between Japan's Kishida Fumio and Joe Biden follows Kishida's controversial raising of Japan's defense budget to 2% of GDP, thus realizing his predecessor Abe Shinzo's dream of militarizing Japan. Abe had sought to buy support for his fascistic turn with his policy of Abenomics to goose the Japanese economy into growth after 2 decades of recession. But where Abenomics had sought structural reform, fiscal expansion and money infusion for this purpose, obstacles from the bureaucracy to whom Abe owed his power narrowed this down to a dependence purely on monetary infusion. Given thus the lack of Japanese internal demand, all that Abenomics could ever do was to raise asset prices and capital exports, making Japan the largest investor in US government bonds ahead of China and thus a pillar of the neoliberal world disorder. The Kishida military budget means to buy loads of cruise missiles produced in the United States, means to establish a new US military base in Okinawa, and thus to form the Japanese gun platform targeting China on the Pacific front of the new Cold War. The new base, the new US military base, it has to be noted, will mean erasing the habitat in Henoko Bay of the sea mammal known as the dugong. At the ministers' meeting prior to the signing of the new alliance, Lloyd Austin, US Secretary of Defense, stated that there will be interoperability between the US and Japanese militaries. Given that this implied a unified command for both militaries, the press naturally raised concerns about how this would be structured, posing questions that were left essentially unanswered. My second point is to give this development important Japanese political context. The opposition Democratic Party of Japan actually came to power in 2009 precisely to remove US military bases from Japan, to seek peace and a new relationship with China, as well as to end austerity. Hatoyama Yukio, as Prime Minister in the new government, was ironically the change candidate for Japan at the same time as Obama was the change candidate for America. The irony, of course, is that the Obama administration colluded in a coup along with the Foreign Affairs, Defense and Finance Ministries of Japan that the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan represents to remove Hatoyama, as well as the leader of the Democratic Party of Japan, Osawa Ishiro, from power. The party's replacement leaders Kan Naoto and Noda Hoshihiko were forced to change the policies of their party. And this lasted until the Liberal Democratic Party of Japan was able to return to power in 2012, led by Abe Shinzo, who, however, garnered a mere 29% of the popular vote in those elections, as the population stayed away from the polls. The Obama administration, it would seem, followed the coup in Japan in 2010 with the coup in Egypt in 2013, which ended the Arab Spring, only to then be involved in the 2014 Maidan coup in Ukraine. The third point I come to is that the hot war in Ukraine took the US by surprise in terms of its intensity and duration. The US intended to goad Russia into war in order to slap unprecedented sanctions that would cause Putin's government's fall. But the fact that this never happened and that the US and NATO were never prepared for the unprecedented intensity and industrial scale of the war that the Russians would wage led to the US now wanting to freeze things down to the level of a Cold War with a Korean-style demilitarized zone in Ukraine, and do this before the 2024 US presidential elections. However, it clearly wants to do this on its own terms. Talk of de-escalation in fact began with Jake Sullivan's Kiev visit in November last year, while recently in an op-ed by David Ignatius in the Washington Post on the 25th of January, a coded message was sent from US Secretary of State Tony Blinken to the Russian leadership, which detailed the US terms for a demilitarized zone in Ukraine. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in a briefing on the 27th of January, would appear to have rejected any such terms. The current Russian view is for a Ukrainian demilitarized zone to be established unilaterally by Russian forces on the ground, it seems, given that no direct negotiations with Ukraine are currently taking place. In the meantime, the language of escalation covers up the desire to de-escalate. Escalation with tanks, fighter jets and all kinds of weapons being promised to the Ukrainians. This practice of surging has always been the way US forces have saved face on their way out of a losing situation. The Russian response, on the other hand, has been to launch regular missile attacks not only to degrade infrastructure and supply lines in the battlefield, but to destroy any new weapons that might be supplied to Ukraine by NATO and the United States. Furthermore, the Russian armed forces have been increased and the Belarusian forces integrated into the Russian military system to establish a gun platform targeting Europe, in a copy of the Ukrainian gun platform that the US and NATO, including the UK, had built to target Russia before Russia started dismantling it. But these are all defensive moves, sending a message that Russia is ready for anything NATO might want to throw at it. The fourth point I come to is that after its survival from US sanctions, it is clear now that the Putin government wants to hold on to its economic gains, especially as China is emerging from its period of COVID restrictions and is gearing up for a new bout of demand-led growth driven by imports, not only of raw materials and energy, but also of intermediate and consumer goods. This is an opportunity offering untold economic promise that Russia is now focusing on while keeping Ukraine at bay, an opportunity that requires massive investment and effort on the part of the Russian government and does not bear distraction in wars on Russia's Western Front. My fifth point is that the project of a Pacific NATO thus starts on extremely shaky ground. NATO military weakness is unmasked in Ukraine in front of the potential East Asian partners that the US and NATO are courting as allies in their Pacific front. Furthermore, and crucially, The cornerstone of this Pacific alliance is also fundamentally compromised in virtue of the essential illegitimacy of the Liberal Democratic Party's rule in Japan. Not just China's own potential, but the unprecedented Russia-China alliance that, between a manufacturing superpower and a resource superpower, is giving credibility to the vast potential in the Eurasian economic space that is being offered to all the countries in the surrounding area. South Korea is the most important US ally after Japan in East Asia, but South Korea's new Indo-Pacific strategy, announced on the 28th of December last year, clearly seeks closer relations with China while expressing coded skepticism of the new Japanese militarism that the US seems to be aiding and abetting. But if there are enormous economic benefits to working with China for South Korea in the medium term, these calculations will also begin to tell in the Taiwanese context. The US passed its unipolar moment with the great financial crash of 2008. Whereas before the Iraq war the US had no government deficit, today it has a government deficit equal to 6% of its gross domestic product. And this is the same percentage that it experienced at the height of the Vietnam War. In these conditions, it now faces the massive economic power of the Eurasian political alliance that China and Russia represent. As mentioned earlier, you can read our detailed analysis on Cold War 2.0 and the subjects raised here in our latest article, for which you can find a link in the video description below, or going to our website, globalshift.com. You can email me on info@globalshift.com with your constructive analyses and comments at any time. We are all here to learn and to discuss. Thank you for listening.